Welcome back, everybody, to our Great Minds in Philosophy series. We have been exploring Immanuel Kant, and so far we have talked about his metaphysics, talking about transcendental metaphysics, as well as the sort of link that exists between the metaphysics of Immanuel Kant as well as his epistemology. This lesson and the next lesson is going to cover his moral philosophy, talk about the ways in which Kant contributed to mainly normative ethics. Now, I will just bear this in mind for people that we do have a series of lessons that is running concurrent to this series of lessons on Immanuel Kant, where we discuss normative ethics, and we spend quite a few lessons. I think we spent about 4 or 5 lessons talking about Kantian ethics as part of that. So this is only going to really provide something of an overview for those of you who just want to have an idea of Kant and his philosophy more broadly. If you want to look at Kantian ethics through the lens of normative ethical theories and how he fits into all of the other ethical theories that we are going to explore in that series, things like utilitarianism and virtue ethics, then go over and have a look at those lessons as well. They're in their own separate playlist. But for now, we're going to talk about some of the contributions that Immanuel Kant makes to ethics. Like I said just a second ago, go and head over to our normative ethics lessons if you want some more detailed lessons on Immanuel Kant's philosophy from an ethical perspective, how Immanuel Kant contributes to normative ethics. So let's begin then. Let's begin by thinking about Kantian ethics, okay? So it should not be overstated just how much of a contribution Immanuel Kant makes to ethical theories. In fact, you could probably argue that Immanuel Kant's normative ethical theory is one of 2 of the most influential and most famous theories of ethics in all of philosophy. Really, you could maybe argue of 3 if you want to include virtue ethics. But his work primarily articulated in a critique of practical reason, but also in his 1785 writings, the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. These establish some of the key principles which will then continue to influence his ethical theory and his subject of ethics more generally. And the area of ethics that at least he is most well known for is this branch of ethics called normative ethics. Now, ethics can be sort of divided into 3 broad categories. You have meta-ethics, which is looking at some of the more metaphysical conceptualizations of ethics. So talking about what it actually means to say that something is good, or to say that something is bad, or moral or immoral. What do these things actually mean? Where does goodness come from? And where does badness come from? Where does immorality come from? Does it make sense to suggest that there is some value that is a sort of ethical value that you place on phrases that are good or that say something is moral or immoral? Or is it just something that we say? Is it just a thing that we utilize in language to sort of to represent whether or not we like or dislike a particular thing? These are all ideas of what we call meta-ethics, and I'm going to be going into meta-ethics after looking at normative ethics. For the most part, generally speaking, if you were to do ethics sort of from a top-down perspective, you would start with meta-ethics. You would deal with the real, quite broadly abstracted theories and ideas of ethics, and then you would make your way down. What Kant contributed a lot to was something known as normative ethics. Now, normative ethics is concerned in the development of what I would describe as sort of systems of normative character that essentially allows you to evaluate what one ought or ought not to do in a particular scenario. Such that, think of it almost like a machine. You plug in an ethical conundrum, and then the machine does its calculations, and then it spits out an answer about what you should and shouldn't do, what is moral and immoral in that situation. What normative ethics is concerned with is constructing the machine, if you will. It is about constructing the systems that you use to then determine whether or not something is moral or immoral. So, for example, Kantian ethics, deontological Kantian ethics, develops a system that you can utilize to try and work out whether or not a situation is moral or immoral, and it is a different system than, for example, utilitarianism or virtue ethics or situation ethics. And so that's how we look at normative ethics. And then finally, the most grounded, down-to-earth, finite area of ethics is an area known as applied ethics. That is essentially where we take everything we've known about meta-ethics and everything we know about normative ethics, and we look to apply our philosophy to real-world situations. So this includes things like animal ethics, or things like environmental ethics, or things like business ethics, these kinds of things, or bioethics. I've got a big textbook behind me on bioethics that includes all kinds of different ethical problems and questions, things like abortion and euthanasia and stem cell research, and what are the ethical implications of all of these things. And that's really just a summary of ethics, really. Most people start with normative ethics and then maybe work their way down. And then if you study philosophy at university, you tend to do meta-ethics a little bit later on. But that's generally how ethics tends to be structured. And like I said, Kant is contributing to this from the sort of normative perspective, or at least he is most well known for contributing from the normative perspective. He is known for the development of something known as deontological ethics. Now, what deontological ethics simply states is that essentially the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions are determined by the actions themselves rather than their consequence. This is by contrast to something known as consequentialist ethics, such as utilitarianism, where, according to a utilitarian of whatever variety, they would say that in order for me to determine whether or not the action that you've just committed is morally right or morally wrong, I'd have to see what the consequences are. If the consequences lead to a more utility as an outcome, then it is moral. If the consequences are quite poor, then it is immoral. Kant did not believe this. Kant did not believe that the consequences of an action should determine and be determinative onto whether or not that action is moral or immoral. He believed that actions have an inherent morality or immorality in and of themselves rather than by contrast to their consequences. So Kant didn't much care about the consequences of actions. He cared more about the actions themselves. So according to Kantian ethics then, the moral value of an action is determined by whether or not it adheres to a moral rule, sometimes known as a moral duty. The reason why it's called a moral duty is because there is an obligation attached to a moral rule, according to Kant, to act in a way as to essentially actuate that particular moral rule. And so that is the case rather than its outcomes. Hence why we call it a deontological theory, because it is based on this idea of duty, a duty to act, a sense of duty in and of itself to perform a moral action in a moral situation. So moral actions, therefore, for Kant are performed out of this sense of duty, and this is the case regardless of the personal inclinations of an individual, or the desires of an individual, or the consequences of the action. Okay, and generally speaking, according to Kant, duty is derived from something known as the moral law. The moral law is objective, so it does not change depending on the subject. It doesn't change for one person over another. It is also universal. It is applied across the entire board. Now, you might think, well, where does the moral law come from? Well, the inclination towards an acceptance of and an understanding of the moral law, should I say, comes from a human being's inherent ability to reason. So reason, rationality, and autonomy all derive this idea of the moral law, this objective and universal principle of the moral law that Kant then builds on top of this idea of the concept of duty. What Kant does is distinguish between actions that are done out of a sense of duty, and those actions are actions that have an inherent moral worth, and then actions which are done out of some sense of desire or inclination. These actions do not have a sense of moral worth according to Kant. Even if actions that align with the moral law, if they are performed for a reason that is not out of just a sense of duty, then they are considered to lack any kind of moral worth. So if, for example, you were to give money to charity, you might do so, and for an ordinary individual, that might be a sense of duty that enshrines a sense of morality, a sense of moral worth to that particular action. But if you do so because you want to get some emotional satisfaction out of it, or you want to gain something in the long run, for example, these are things that therefore undermine that action as then having a distinct lack of moral worth. So I've already sort of touched on this, but essentially, when we think about the moral law, you might think, well, where does the moral law come from? What does Kant believe to be the source of the moral law? Or as I've written on this slide here, what does Kant believe to be the philosophical grounding of the moral law? Well, he argues that it is grounded in the autonomy of rational agents. Rational beings are what he describes as self-legislators, meaning that they have the capacity to recognize and to follow moral laws, and they give to themselves through rational deliberation. And it is there that we see a foundation. It is there that we see a philosophical grounding of the moral law, from which we can build upon this philosophical grounding and determine what is and is not a sense of duty. And then from there we can understand that things that are done out of an inclination or a desire are considered to not have any kind of moral worth. Things that are done in adherence to the moral law are done out of a sense of duty and therefore do have moral worth. The next question is then, how do we develop a system for determining which actions are moral or immoral according to a Kantian ethical perspective? Well, that's what the next lesson is going to explore, because the next lesson is going to talk about Kant's categorical imperative.